I also want to say thank you once again because this topic made me stretch my mind. And that is quite good. What happens in academia is that you end up being given the same topic again and again. So it was good to get this one, especially on faith, because faith is something very dear to me. I'm a Protestant, but faith is something that I have come to value quite a bit as I grow older. So I'm going to use many Christian examples. I'm very sorry for those who are of the Islamic faith. I hope it's okay. I'm also looking forward to hearing from our Muslim brothers and sisters. I happen to teach French also, and a lot of the African literature I teach is from Islamic countries. And one of the things that I struggle with when I'm teaching literature is that the students don't see the stories because they forget that Muslims are also human beings who face different challenges, just like everybody else. So the first thing they tell me is, but they're Muslims. And I'm like, but you are supposed to hear their story. So that's one of the challenges of knowledge that we have that I'm going to talk a bit more about. So I'm going to begin my reflections with the question, what does faith have to do with identity? And as I promised, I'm going to be controversial and provocative, and I will say nothing. In my presentation, I'm going to argue that if we are truly people of faith, the question of identity should not be anywhere near our faith. And I'm going to use the Gospels for my examples. So when I started thinking of this presentation, the first story that came to mind was that of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at the well, which is narrated in John 4. The passage reveals an extended discussion of identity in the worldly sense as we know it today. We know identity as exclusion, boundaries, and conflict, rather than love and sharing. But also remember that the regime in power at the time was the Roman Empire, and the British Empire mimicked the Roman Empire when they came to Kenya in the late 1880s. And then after that, we got another mimicry called independence. So we are living under the mimicry of the empire that Jesus lived under. So the political logic that runs through the empire was revived in Europe in the 17th century from the ruins of the Roman Empire, but it was baptized a renaissance. And as far as I'm concerned, that was not a renaissance. It was the exploring and excavation of graves, because the Roman Empire had died. And then as Europe began to gain more wealth, families like the Medici family wanted to impress the rest of Italy and Europe, so they hired artists and scientists to go back to the dead empire and seek inspiration for something new. So essentially, they looked for the living among the dead. So the idea of the state, senate, law, and even management of people with multiple cultural backgrounds was borrowed from the ruins of Rome. So Rome operated as a centralized government with provinces at the periphery and a multicultural mix of many people from different provinces around the world. Not all subjects of the empire were considered Romans. Historians mark the reign of Augustus as the point at which citizenship transformed from being about rights and duties to a passive one about legal status and honor. Under Augustus, the Latin language gained more prominence as a marker of being Roman, and the empire continued to make a distinction between those who were born in Rome and those who were not. And as Rome began to deteriorate, they invited the Barbarians, who were the Germanic peoples, to fight for the Roman Empire, but simultaneously not access the rights of citizens of Rome. So barbarians were the people who spoke an incomprehensible language, according to the Romans. And the expression barbarians at the gate became a popular one to capture the fear of insiders of the city, that their city was facing imminent collapse from the hands of immigrants. But going back to John 4, we see the conversation between the Samaritan woman and Jesus, who lived in the Roman Empire, and Jesus rejects this imperial view of identity, where discrimination is unspoken and yet it is real when it comes to human relations. So when Jesus asks for water, he's speaking as a human being to another. And what does the Samaritan woman say? I paraphrase her. What she's telling Jesus is that, according to my ethnicity, I'm not supposed to give you water. And then Jesus replies, but the water I'm giving you is providing eternal life, meaning that even if I ask you for the literal water, I do so as a human being. And then Jesus tests another aspect of her identity, which is that of gender. So he asks her whether she has a husband, and then he reveals that he knows that she has had several, that she's living with a man who is not her husband. According to today's standards, people would call the Samaritan woman a failed woman because no man wants her. But in revealing that he knows her marital status, Jesus is saying in so many words, I spoke to you as a human being, not as your gender or as a wife of a man. And in between the conversation, and this is why I remembered this passage, Jesus reveals the principle of his engagement. He says in verse 23 and 24, but the hour is coming, now and here, when true worshippers will worship God in spirit and truth, for God is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. So spirit and truth, there's no identity there. Yet there's yet another Samaritan story, which is the world-famous Good Samaritan. And this parable begins with a trick question about what one must do to inherit eternal life. In the end, the question becomes, who is my neighbor? And Jesus once again tells the story of insiders. So you still have the insiders and the outsiders. The insiders are a priest and a Levite who walk past an injured man. The Samaritan, whose identity is of an outsider, is the one who shows mercy to the injured man. And we could read this story as saying that we can get help from the most unexpected quarters, but I see it differently. The story shows that humanity is larger than identity. What matters is that we are able to see the humanity in somebody else, like the Good Samaritan did, rather than to look for laws and religion as the priest and the Levite did. My point is that human values like love, mercy, and most of all, worship in spirit and in truth are what matter more than identity, because God is spirit and truth. Many of the people who come to Jesus for healing, he intervenes on the basis of faith, not on their identity. You have in Luke 7, the Roman officer who should be looking down on a colonized subject, but when he talks to Jesus, he reverses the roles, and he says he's not worthy of Jesus coming under his roof. And he tells Jesus, just give me the order, and it will be done. And when Jesus heard the centurion speak, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So the issue again is faith. And with a civil servant, I was just thinking to myself, I would rather Jesus didn't heal the centurion's son, but Jesus healed him. And then there's a story of Mark 9, of a loving father who had pursued healing for his demon-possessed son. The story begins with a commotion caused by the fact that the disciples were not able to heal the young man. And when he comes to Jesus, he says, if you can do anything, have compassion on us, and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. And then Jesus rebuked the spirit. I really love this story because a lot of times my faith is shaken by all the evil I see in the world. So I'm always telling God, help my unbelief. But I think that is the deepest admission of faith, because we are basically saying we trust God so much that we are willing to be vulnerable and honest before God. So there are many stories. The story of the man who opened the roof, and Jesus heals the paralyzed man when he sees the faith of the people, of his friends. Then the woman who had been having an issue of blood for 12 years, and when she finally confesses that she touched his garment, Jesus tells her, your faith made you well. So Jesus doesn't ask people where they came from. He's moved by their faith in God, by the love of the people who are assisting people to seek healing on behalf of their patient, of the patient. No matter their background, Jesus affirms that what unites them is faith. So how did we get to a place where we are talking about identity as African Christians? And I think we have to go back to colonialism, because what the European state did was to codify through the document that the Pope Francis repudiated, the doctrine of discovery. They codified discrimination between the non-civilized to mean non-European and the civilized to mean European. And there's a certain dishonesty in that kind of discrimination, because a word like civilization should be a human endeavor, but instead it was used as a boundary and a fragmentation of humanity. And in fact, the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire clarified in very powerful words in Discours sur le colonialisme, that, or Discourse on Colonialism, that there was no problem with people traveling to different lands and meeting different people. The problem wasn't that Europeans were foreigners. It was that they were hosted as equals, but they returned the favor with violence. The problem was not the contact, it was the lack of mutual human interaction. And this is what Césaire says. He says, it is a good thing to place different civilizations in contact with each other. That is an excellent thing to blend different worlds, that whatever its own particular genius may be, a civilization that withdraws into itself atrophies, that for civilizations exchange is oxygen, that a nation which colonizes, that a civilization which justifies colonization and therefore force is already a sick civilization, a civilization which is morally diseased, which is irresistibly progressing from one consequence to another and one denial to another. So this goal of civilization, from what happened to us, was not to affirm humanity. It was to fragment, create division and conflict. It was to do the opposite of what Jesus said in the stories I have cited, which is to look for the common denominator that united all people, which is faith, spirit, and truth. So if identity is not central to our humanity, how did it become so important, and why is it so divisive? Why does identity make people feel ashamed rather than confident, hostile rather than friendly? I think the answer lies now, I'll come to my major concern, knowledge, and what the state does to knowledge and identity. The state creates an identity that is based on a narrow, truncated view of knowledge, in contrast to the knowledge on which faith is based. James C. Scott says in his book, Seeing Like a State, he says that the state is interested in simplifying human beings to make them easy to read and not have to think about, because the state's interest is in only three things: taxing people, using people for labor and war, and ensuring that people do not rebel. That means that the state's only interest in human beings is three things: how much tax can you pay? When are you going to work or fight for the state? And are you going to comply? So one of the issues that I was asked to talk about is compliance. So the state necessarily imposes knowledge that is narrow and restricted and makes people know so little and base extraordinarily heavy decisions on such little knowledge. And the government, at least in Kenya, announced its hostility to knowledge when it openly told Kenyans that the competency-based curriculum is all skills and no knowledge. It was a small statement that escaped the attention of most Kenyans because the media had misled Kenyans to believe that theory, knowledge, cramming, and examinations all mean the same thing. We were openly told that all we were good for was conscription as labor. And the church, the promoters of faith that is supposed to see people beyond their social circumstances and in their complexity, had only one reply: make morality control the people more. They simply continued to play the same role as the missionaries in the colonial era, which was to police Africans through morality, like the Pharisees who were bothering the man who was born blind after Jesus healed him. For the Pharisees in that story, it was more important to protect old beliefs than to welcome this new reality of a man who was born blind and now could see. And this attitude has an implication for education. It means the state has little interest in Kenyans being knowledgeable despite performing political democracy. Let me give you an example. The vote. On a small piece of paper, millions of Kenyans put a tick, which is supposed to make a huge decision about governance for the next 5 years. But how much do Kenyans know when they are making that decision? So little. The media hardly offers any enlightening conversation. The campaigns are full of stupidity. I encourage you to read the article by Dan Ojwang about the post-election violence. He said that preceding that violence, so many lies were told. They were not questioned by people with the education, but asked to do so, and they were not noticed by the Kenyan public because of the war on knowledge, especially on history and memory. Right now, as I've said, our children are going to a school system which Ministry of Education officials declared was good because it had no knowledge, only skills. And our president declared that there's no need to study history because learning when Vasco da Gama landed in Malindi cannot fix a sewer or a tap. In such an environment, anti-intellectualism narrows people to their geography and to their parentage and birth. The state is basically saying that it does not need to know much about us as long as we are paying taxes and we are not challenging the state. The state even decides from the ID how one will vote, as if a person has no brain. And this has a story that has been told by Dr. Joyce Nyairo, who recounts her experience of trying to get the correct details of her birthplace on her ID card. The government officials kept getting the details wrong because of assumptions about her ethnicity. She remarks that at the ID office, the government officials were engaged in banter about the identity of married women, but what was most alarming was that the ease with which the records that were entered on the ID were connected to the vote. And this is her words: as if the mere act of transferring one's district guaranteed a transfer of one's political affiliations. So what is really at stake here is intellectual rigidity and laziness. We have just decided not to know people beyond what we see and what we assume. Not long ago, Kenyans liked to say, your name explains everything, which was another way of saying you have no brain, no life, no ideas, no history, nothing except what your ID says. Dr. Nyairo calls this the anthropology of fixed identities, where people are assigned to static characteristics and geographies, defined not even by us, but by poorly informed Western researchers who were often missionaries or explorers. And so Nyairo says, right from that colonial moment, the question of tribe was sealed in stasis. Once a tribe is named and described, there can be no suggestion, no deviation, no change, no revision. What is happening is really we are being told there are parts of our lives that do not matter. And if we keep being told this, then we essentially do not belong. We cannot be citizens if we keep on having to cut off parts of our lives for the purpose of the state. And so we are back to the Roman Empire, where people were considered non-Romans, who were considered non-Romans were called barbarians. And I think faith, by contrast to this very limited idea of knowledge, is that faith requires a breadth of knowledge. As we see in the stories in the Gospels, faith entails knowledge of a person's personal circumstances, empathy with their situation, and most of all, acknowledgement of one's humanity that transcends their place of birth or their social circumstances. Faith entails seeing people from their humanity or from their status as children of God who can worship in spirit and truth. And knowledge sits at the heart of faith, because one cannot have faith without knowledge. This means that the church must abandon its complacency with a truncated, narrow conception of knowledge and an education system where we accept the government's extremely narrow concept of education, where Kenyans are reduced to what they can do for institutions. Faith calls us to see people in their totality, independent of institutional benefits, and we need to see them, whether they are thirsty, sick, or powerful, as members of a large community that worships God in spirit and in truth. That is why faith contradicts identity, at least as defined by the state. So what we need to be talking about is not identity, but to what do we belong? With the state as it's currently constructed, we will always be barbarians waiting outside the gate. We will never belong because the state does not see us as human beings. As we know from the history of the Roman Empire, Rome fell because it did not want barbarians to belong, and yet at the same time, it wanted to use barbarians to maintain the empire. The contradiction was not sustainable in Rome, and it's not sustainable in Africa. And we have proof from how much pain and suffering we have witnessed in Africa in the name of identity. Rome fell, and the state will fall. Because what we need is a new political logic where human beings worship in spirit and in truth. So I think we need to face our reality and probably reconsider identity as our primary preoccupation. But to do so, we need knowledge that empowers our people to accommodate knowledge of others beyond where they were born and to whom they were born. Without that knowledge, people cannot have faith and they cannot worship God in spirit and in truth. And if we cannot worship God in spirit and in truth, we are going to fight over boundaries, identities, and customs. However, our people are starved everywhere, at least in Kenya. Our people are starved of knowledge because knowledge is being crushed by the state. Our people need philosophy, they need access to the metaphysical. And since I'm in a Catholic institution, we can also talk about philosophy being dominated by the Catholic Church in Kenya and not being taught in our schools. I think promotion of philosophy as a subject would be one way to reduce our conflict over identity. So I think the challenge I'm leaving is that we have to abandon our alliance with the state in its delusions that people can remain ignorant and be governed well, and that we have to promote the growth of knowledge and the worship of God in spirit and in truth. Thank you very much.